Welcome, traveler. You've found your way to this quiet corner of the night, where stories whisper and shadows stretch. I am the storyteller, and tonight, I'll guide you into a world of mystery and dreams. I know many of you come here to unwind, to let your mind drift as sleep slowly takes over. So before we begin, take a deep breath, and if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It helps keep the stories alive. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it? I love knowing how far my voice reaches in the silence of the night. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let the story begin. There are few places left in the world where you can truly feel alone. Not the kind of loneliness you get in an empty house or on a quiet street, but something deeper, an isolation so complete that it gnaws at the edges of your mind. That was what James and I wanted. For years, my brother and I had planned this trip, a wildlife expedition into one of Africa's most remote nature reserves. We weren't amateurs. We had hiked through rainforests, camped in the Rockies, and spent nights under the stars in deserts where silence stretched for miles. But this was different. This was a land untouched, where nature ruled without mercy. The journey had been long, a flight, a brutal drive over dirt roads, and then an hours-long trek on foot. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was beginning its slow descent, bleeding gold and crimson across the vast savanna. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and distant rain, and the occasional cries of unseen creatures echoed through the trees. Baobabs stood like ancient sentinels, their gnarled trunks thick enough to hide secrets that had existed for centuries. The grass stretched endlessly, rustling with unseen movement. Somewhere in the distance, a lion's low rumble sent a shiver through me, though I told myself it was excitement rather than fear. James, always the more practical one, dropped his pack and stretched. "This is what we came for, isn't it?" he said, grinning. "No phones, no noise, no people. Just us and the wild." I nodded, though something felt off. It wasn't the wildlife. Encountering predators was expected. It was something else. A feeling, like we weren't alone. As we set up camp, I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. There, on the bark of a baobab near our tents, were deep gouges, claw marks. I had seen plenty of animal markings before, but these were strange. They weren't random slashes like a leopard might leave behind. They were deliberate, and interwoven between the claw marks were symbols, human-like symbols. I traced my fingers over them, feeling the rough bark beneath. "James, come look at this." He walked over, squinting at the tree. "Poachers," he said, shrugging. "Probably marking hunting spots or trails. Don't let it spook you." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long across the land, I felt a chill settle in my bones. We weren't alone out here, and something was watching us. The fire crackled between us, sending flickering shadows dancing across the tall grass. The night air was thick with the scent of burning wood, dried earth, and something wilder, the raw, untamed aroma of the savanna. Crickets sang their endless chorus, joined occasionally by the eerie whoop of distant hyenas. James ripped open a pack of dried meat, tossing a piece into his mouth. "This is perfect," he said between chews. "No noise, no people, just us and the wild." I nodded, though my mind wasn't as at ease as his. Something about the clawed tree, those strange markings, gnawed at me. But I didn't want to ruin the night with paranoia. I took a deep breath, trying to focus on the moment. The warmth of the fire, the sky bursting with stars, the sheer vastness of the land. Then the sound came, a rustling in the bushes, not the soft flutter of birds or the skittering of a small creature. This was something bigger, heavy, slow. James froze mid-bite, his eyes flicking toward the darkness beyond the fire's glow. I reached for my knife instinctively. "You hear that?" "Yeah," he muttered, setting down his food. We both grabbed our flashlights, aiming the beams toward the brush. The grass trembled, parting ever so slightly. The firelight didn't reach far enough, and the flashlight beams only deepened the shadows. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then, silence. No movement. No sound. The night had gone unnaturally still. For a full minute, neither of us spoke. James took a slow step forward, his flashlight sweeping left and right. Nothing. The grass swayed lazily in the wind, as if nothing had disturbed it. Probably just a hyena, James said, forcing a chuckle. But it didn't reach his eyes. I wanted to believe him, but something inside me whispered that we were being watched. And then the smell hit us. Thick, pungent, rotten. A sickly sweet stench of decaying flesh drifted through the air, so strong it made my stomach turn. James gagged, covering his nose. Jesus, what the hell is that? My grip tightened around my knife. I don't know, but I think we should find out. James hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. We moved cautiously, flashlights cutting through the dark. The smell grew stronger with each step until we saw it. A few meters from our camp, half hidden behind a fallen tree, lay the carcass of an antelope. It had been torn apart, its ribs jutting out like broken fingers. But something was wrong. The wounds weren't clean, like a lion's kill. They were jagged, uneven, almost as if something had hacked at the flesh with crude, brutal force. The lower half of the animal was missing entirely, as though it had been dragged away. Flies buzzed in thick clouds around the open wounds. And then I saw the bones, arranged in a pattern, not scattered like a predator's leftovers, but deliberately placed. A ring of rib bones encircled the corpse, and at the center, the skull had been set upright, staring at us with empty sockets. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. James, I whispered, this isn't an animal kill. He swallowed hard. No, it's not. And then I saw the handprint. On a nearby rock, smeared in dark, congealed blood, was the unmistakable shape of a human hand. Bigger than mine, bigger than James, and fresh. I took a step back. We need to go? Now. James exhaled, rubbing his face. Look, I won't pretend this isn't messed up, but it could still be poachers. Ritual hunters, maybe. If we leave now, we'll be wandering in the dark. It's safer to stay put until morning. James, something did this. And it's close. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly shaken but trying to stay logical. We have weapons. We have fire. We stick together. We'll pack up at first light. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But he was right about one thing. Stumbling blindly through the wilderness at night wasn't smart. Still, as we turned back toward camp, my gut twisted with the same sickening certainty I had felt since we arrived. We weren't alone out here. And whatever had left that handprint, it knew we were here. The night stretched on, thick and suffocating. Every sound, the rustle of the wind, the chirp of a distant insect, felt magnified. Sleep didn't come easy, not after what we had seen. James and I lay in our tents, knives within reach, flashlights off to preserve battery life. But I wasn't resting. My mind kept circling back to the bones, the handprint, the unnatural wounds on that antelope. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A gunshot. Sharp, distant, but unmistakable. I sat up instantly, heart pounding. Another shot rang out, followed by another, short bursts of fire, echoing through the night like distant thunder. James was already awake, his silhouette barely visible in the dark. "Poachers," he whispered. His voice was tense. I nodded slowly, but something about the gunfire didn't sit right with me. Poachers usually worked in silence, using traps or single, muffled shots. But this sounded like a firefight. James moved quickly, reaching for the fire pit. With one sweep of his boot, he kicked dirt over the embers, smothering the glow. Darkness swallowed us whole. We waited, straining our ears. The gunfire had stopped. The savannah had returned to its eerie silence, but the air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, fast, crashing through the underbrush. Someone was running toward us. I grabbed my knife, holding my breath. James crouched beside me, his fists clenched. Then, out of the blackness, a figure stumbled into our camp. A man, dressed in torn camouflage, his face streaked with dirt and blood. He gasped, his body heaving with exertion. His eyes were wide, frantic, whites flashing in the dark. He opened his mouth, his voice barely above a whisper. "They are hunting men." His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. "Not animals." Then he collapsed. For a moment, neither James nor I moved. The only sound was the rasp of the man's breathing, shallow and weak. I knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder. "Hey, who's hunting men?" His lips parted, but before he could answer, a branch snapped. Not far. James and I locked eyes. We weren't alone. Then they emerged. Shadowy figures, slipping through the trees. I couldn't see their faces, only the glint of metal, rifles, machetes. They moved slowly, deliberately, like wolves circling prey. James inhaled sharply. Run. He didn't need to say it twice. We grabbed what we could, our packs, our knives, nothing more, and bolted. Behind us, voices barked in a language I didn't recognize. Then, gunfire. The sharp cracks split the night as we dove into the bush. Branches whipped at my face. My legs burned as we sprinted through the darkness, feet pounding against dry earth. More gunshots rang out, splintering wood, kicking up dust. They were chasing us. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. The wilderness swallowed us, trees and tall grass blurring together. My lungs screamed for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. Another shot. Too close. Then James grabbed my arm and yanked me sideways. We slid down an embankment, tumbling into a dry riverbed. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my bones, but I bit back a cry. Above us, footsteps rushed past, our pursuers missing our hiding spot by inches. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice. Low, gruff, speaking in a tongue I didn't understand. They were still looking. James pressed a finger to his lips, eyes locked onto mine. We barely breathed. Then, a branch creaked. Someone was coming down. I gripped my knife tighter, my mind racing. If they found us here, it would be over. James tensed beside me, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing. If we were going to survive the night, we had to keep running. The riverbed was a thin ribbon of water cutting through the dry land, barely knee-deep in most places. We stopped at its edge, panting, bent over, hands on our knees. The chase had drained us, every muscle in my body burning from the relentless sprint. James was the first to break the silence. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice raw from exertion. I shook my head, still gasping for breath. "Not poachers," I managed. "Something else." Moonlight shimmered off the slow-moving water, casting a silvery glow on the mud and scattered reeds. But something else caught my eye, things sticking out of the ground along the banks. Strange totems. They were made of bone and feathers, bound together with strips of dried sinew. Some had small animal skulls attached, their empty sockets staring blindly into the night. Others bore human-like figures carved into wood, their faces stretched in silent agony. A chill ran through me. These weren't some hunter's markers. James reached out and touched one of the totems, but the moment his fingers grazed it, he yanked his hand back with a hiss. "Jesus, it's warm." I stared at him. "What?" He shook his head, rubbing his fingers together like trying to rid himself of something unseen. "It feels like flesh, like it's alive." I swallowed hard. We needed to move. I stepped carefully over the mud, avoiding the eerie totems as we followed the river deeper into the wilderness. The further we went, the more unnatural the silence became. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Even the wind had died. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. And that was when we heard them. The chanting started as a whisper in the distance. Low, rhythmic, a deep, guttural hum that pulsed through the trees like the heartbeat of something ancient. James stiffened beside me. "Tell me you hear that." I nodded, gripping my knife tighter. The sound wasn't coming from one place. It was everywhere, circling us, closing in. Then, among the trees, we saw them. Pale figures. They stood motionless in the darkness, barely visible in the moonlight. Their bodies were smeared in white ash, making them blend into the landscape like ghosts. Their faces were expressionless, hollow eyes locked onto us. They did not move. They did not speak. They only watched. James exhaled sharply. "We need to go? Now." We moved cautiously, forcing ourselves not to break into another sprint. Something told me that if we ran, they would chase. The chanting grew louder. I could feel it in my chest now, vibrating through my ribs. The figures didn't follow, but I knew they were still watching, tracking us. Then, just ahead, we saw it. The remains of an old encampment. And that was when I knew. This wasn't the first time outsiders had been hunted here. The camp was abandoned, half swallowed by the wilderness. Torn tents flapped weakly in the breeze, their fabric shredded like something had ripped through them with claws. Rusted cooking pots lay scattered on the ground, long since overgrown with weeds. The air smelled of damp earth, decay, and something metallic, blood. James kicked at the dirt, uncovering a boot. A human boot. My stomach twisted. "Someone else was here?" I said. James nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, and they didn't make it out." Scattered around the clearing were bones, human bones. Some were snapped clean, others still had fragments of dried flesh clinging to them. But what made my blood run cold was the skulls. Each one was carved. Symbols, the same ones we had seen on the trees, etched deep into the bone. Some had jagged lines running across the forehead, others had intricate spirals carved around the eye sockets. This wasn't random. This was ritual. James ran a hand over his face, exhaling shakily. This isn't a poaching operation. This is something else. I swallowed against the bile rising in my throat. A cult. James looked at me, his eyes dark. A cult that hunts people. The chanting was closer now. I turned back toward the trees. The figures were still there, still watching. And then, for the first time, one of them took a step forward. The abandoned shack loomed ahead, a skeletal structure barely standing against the night wind. It was small, its wooden walls warped and rotting, likely left behind by an old hunting expedition long forgotten. But it was shelter. James and I rushed inside, slamming the rickety door shut behind us. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of decay clinging to the walls. My breath came in short, panic bursts as I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady myself. Outside, the chanting had stopped. Silence stretched across the night. James crept toward a shattered window, peering out cautiously. "I think we lost them," he whispered. Something slammed against the door. Hard. I jumped back as the wood groaned under the impact. James spun around, knife in hand. Then, another blow. The door splintered. Before we could react, the wall behind James exploded inward. A pale hand shot through the broken wood, grabbing his arm. He shouted, struggling, but more hands appeared, too many to fight off. I lunged for him, but before I could reach him, James was yanked backward into the dark. His scream echoed into the night. I stumbled forward, reaching for the jagged hole in the wall. James. Nothing. Just the rustling of leaves. And then, silence. My hands trembled. My knife was gone, lost in the chaos. I was alone, unarmed. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I had to move. I had to find him, and I had to do it fast. I followed the sound of distant chanting, my body running on sheer adrenaline. The forest had changed, twisted in a way I couldn't explain. The trees loomed taller, their branches gnarled like clawed fingers. Shadows moved where there should be none. Then I saw the firelight. A clearing opened before me, bathed in the flickering glow of flames. In the center, a massive stone slab stood, its surface stained dark. James was bound to it. His wrists and ankles were tied with thick, fibrous rope, his head slumped forward. He wasn't moving. Around him, the cultists swayed in unison, whispering in a language I didn't understand. Their bodies were covered in white ash, their faces painted with horrific symbols. Some wore necklaces of bone. Others had sharpened teeth, filed into points. At the head of the ritual stood a figure unlike the others. The high priest. He wore a headdress made of animal skulls, and in his hands, he held a dagger, carved from bone, its edges jagged like teeth. He raised it high above James' chest. The chanting grew louder. I had seconds. If I didn't act now, James would die. I dropped low, creeping through the underbrush. My fingers curled around a rock, the only weapon I had. My pulse was a drumbeat in my skull. One of the cultists stood near the edge of the clearing, his back turned. I moved fast. The rock connected with the base of his skull with a sickening crack. He crumpled without a sound. I grabbed his knife. The next cultist never saw me coming. A sharp slice to the throat. Hot blood sprayed against my hands as he collapsed. Then I was moving, no longer thinking, just acting. James groaned, his head lolling to the side. He was waking up. The high priest turned. Our eyes met. For a split second, time froze. Then I lunged. I crashed into him, driving my knife upward. He let out a guttural scream as we hit the ground, the bone dagger clattering away. The cultists shrieked in unison, their voices rising into a high-pitched wail. I didn't stop. I drove the knife down again, once, twice. The high priest's body spasmed beneath me, his breath gurgling. Then he went still. The chanting faltered. I scrambled to my feet, slicing through James' restraints. His eyes fluttered open, dazed. "We have to go," I whispered. Then I grabbed a burning torch from the fire, and I set the altar ablaze. Flames roared, licking up the stone, swallowing the carved symbols, the bloodstains, the relics of their twisted ritual. The cultists shrieked. But it wasn't just human voices. Their screams twisted, warped, somehow deeper, inhuman. Shadows writhed in the firelight, their shapes stretching and contorting. The air trembled as if something ancient was howling from beyond the veil. James staggered to his feet, his body weak but alive. I grabbed his arm. "Run!" We bolted, sprinting through the trees as the flames spread behind us. The cultists wailed, their cries growing fainter. The forest itself seemed to shudder. Then, suddenly, silence. We burst free of the tree line, gasping for air. The sky was turning gray with the first light of dawn. James collapsed to his knees, breathing hard. I stood beside him, my hands still shaking. We were alive, but we would never be the same. And behind us, in the depths of the wilderness, the fire still burned. We ran. The fire behind us raged, crackling like bones snapping in the heat. But it wasn't just the flames that roared. Something else, something wrong, howled from within the inferno. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was deeper, layered, like a chorus of voices speaking in a language older than time. The sound twisted through the air, vibrating through my ribs, clawing at my skull. My vision blurred. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself forward. James was just ahead of me, stumbling, barely keeping his balance. His breathing was ragged, his body weak from whatever they had done to him. I grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. Almost there. I gasped. Then, up ahead, light. Flashlights. Voices. For a brief second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, the beams cut through the darkness, bobbing as men in uniform moved through the trees. Park rangers. They were shouting now, rushing toward us. One of them raised a rifle, scanning the darkness behind us. James collapsed at their feet, gasping. I followed, dropping to my knees, my chest heaving. And then, silence. I turned, expecting to see them. The cultists. The figures painted in white ash. The high priest's lifeless body. The twisted relics of their ritual. But there was nothing. The fire was still smoldering, black smoke curling into the sky. But the clearing, the altar, the bones, the symbols, was empty. It was as if they had never been there. The rangers led us to their outpost, gave us water, wrapped us in blankets, and asked questions. Too many questions. James did most of the talking, his voice hoarse, his hands shaking as he recounted everything. The chase, the cultists, the ritual, the fire. I watched the rangers as he spoke. They never interrupted, but they exchanged looks. Uneasy glances, the kind people give when they already know the answer but don't want to hear it out loud. When James finished, one of the rangers, a grizzled man with deep lines on his face, sighed. "We'll send a team to investigate in the morning," he said, but his tone was hollow. Like he already knew they wouldn't find anything. I leaned forward. "You've seen this before, haven't you?" The ranger didn't answer. James swallowed hard. What the hell was that? The ranger held my gaze for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. "Get some rest," he muttered. And that was the end of it. Days later, after we were flown back home, I couldn't let it go. The images haunted me. James tied to the altar, the chanting, the inhuman scream from the fire. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their painted faces staring from the trees. I had to know. I started researching disappearances in the region, digging through old records, forums, anything I could find. And then I saw it. A pattern. Stories, some buried in obscure travel reports, others whispered in survival forums, of people vanishing in that stretch of wilderness. Some were found days later, wandering, disoriented, unable to explain what had happened. Others were never found at all. And in every case, there were rumors of a cult, a nameless, faceless group that had existed for centuries, moving in the shadows, hunting, taking, leaving behind nothing but whispers and scorched earth. Some said they worshipped something older than man, something that didn't just demand blood, but souls. I closed my laptop, my hands cold. A breeze drifted in through the open window. It was a quiet night. No sounds but the rustling leaves, the hum of the city outside. But then, somewhere, just at the edge of my hearing, a low, rhythmic whispering. Chanting. I turned sharply. The room was empty, but my skin prickled. My pulse quickened, because deep down I knew I would never truly be free. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the chanting. We planned this trip for months. marking Maple Creek Forest on our maps as the perfect getaway. It was supposed to be one of those weekends where we escaped from everything: work, school, and the endless noise of the city. Just the four of us, a couple of tents, and the quiet of nature. Liam, my best friend, had been the one to suggest it. He was always the logical one, the planner. Mia, his girlfriend, brought the energy, always ready for an adventure but the first to scream at a spider. Ben, the quietest of us, didn't say much but was always steady, always reliable. And then there was me, Ethan. I'd been camping for years, even before I met the others. I knew how to read a map, how to start a fire, how to tell which plants wouldn't make you sick. The hike up was perfect. The air was crisp, that kind of autumn chill that makes you feel alive. The trees were turning gold and orange, leaves crunching beneath our boots. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the occasional burst of wood smoke from distant campsites. We passed a few groups on our way in, exchanging nods and quick greetings. After 2 hours, we reached our chosen campsite, right at the tree line, near a clearing that overlooked a narrow stream. It was secluded, away from the more popular spots, exactly what we wanted. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows through the trees. As we set up camp, I felt it for the first time, something off. The forest was too quiet. I told myself I was imagining it. There were no signs of anything wrong. The air was still. No strange tracks, no odd smells. But usually, even in a quiet forest, you hear something. Birds, distant rustling, the occasional snap of a branch. Here, there was only us. I shook it off. I'd been in forests before where the silence felt heavy, where the wind barely stirred the leaves. Besides, we had a good weekend ahead of us. No reason to let my mind play tricks on me. We finished setting up, got a fire going, and settled in for the night, completely unaware that by the end of this trip, we would wish we had never come. By the time the sun dipped below the treetops, the air had grown sharper, laced with the damp bite of oncoming cold. We huddled around the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, their glow barely pushing back the growing darkness. That was when the fog rolled in. It came too fast, spilling in from the trees like it had been waiting. One moment, the forest stretched out around us, and the next, everything beyond our campfire vanished into a thick, swirling gray. The trees, the stream, even the sky above, gone. The only sound was the crackling fire, now strangely muffled, as if the fog were swallowing the noise before it could travel. "Okay, that's a little creepy," Mia said, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "It's just fog," Liam replied, ever the rational one. Temperature must have dropped fast. Cold air meeting warm ground. Ben said nothing, but I caught him glancing toward the trees, his jaw tight. I didn't like it either. I'd seen fog settle over forests before, but never like this. This was thick, unnatural. It pressed against us, making the open campsite feel suddenly claustrophobic. To shake off the unease, we did what any group of campers would do. We told ghost stories. Mia went first, weaving a tale about a woman in white who lured hikers into the woods, never to be seen again. Liam rolled his eyes but smiled, enjoying the way Mia got theatrical, her hands gesturing wildly in the firelight. Then Ben spoke up, surprising us all. His story was simpler, about an empty town where people woke up to find the streets deserted, their neighbors gone, tables set for meals no one would ever eat. Something about that last one stuck with me. Then Mia gasped, "Guys, what is that?" We turned to follow her gaze. Through the fog, just beyond the tree line, a shape loomed, a structure that hadn't been there before. A cabin. I frowned. That wasn't on the map. Maybe it's an old ranger's cabin? Liam suggested, but even he didn't sound sure. The building was small but sturdy looking, with a pitched roof and wooden walls that didn't seem as weathered as they should have been. A single window reflected the dying firelight, dark and hollow. "Should we check it out?" Mia asked. Ben finally spoke. "No," but curiosity won over caution, and within minutes, we were making our way toward the cabin, our flashlights cutting through the fog. The door was wooden, slightly warped but solid, and when I reached out to test it, it swung open with a low creak. The inside was strange. The air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. A fireplace sat cold against the far wall, though there was no dust on the mantel, no ash in the hearth. A wooden table was set for dinner, for plates, for glasses, silverware placed neatly beside them. The food on the plates was untouched. Not rotten, not fresh. Just there. "This is weird," Mia whispered. I ran a finger along the back of a wooden chair. No dust, no signs of long-term abandonment. It was as if someone had just left, moments before we arrived, waiting for something to return. A heavy silence settled over us. Outside, the fog thickened. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, a sound, soft, distant, impossible to tell if it was laughter or the wind. And for the first time that night, I felt something close to fear. The decision to stay in the cabin was made quickly, almost too quickly. No one said it outright, but none of us wanted to step back into that dense, unnatural fog. Our tents were barely 100 feet away, yet the idea of walking back through that soupy darkness sent a chill through me. Liam was the first to break the silence. "We'll sleep here tonight. It's dry, warmer than a tent, and the fog should clear by morning." No one argued. We moved our gear inside, unrolling sleeping bags on the wooden floor. The cabin was bare except for the eerie dinner table and the cold fireplace. There were no personal belongings, no signs of who had once stayed here. Just a single lantern, which we lit, casting long, flickering shadows against the wooden walls. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick and unmoving. I lay down, my head resting on my backpack, listening to the deep silence around us. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hoot of an owl. Just stillness. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A soft, deliberate sound against the window. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The others were already half asleep, their bodies rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. I turned toward the window, my pulse thudding in my ears. There was nothing there, just the fog, swirling faintly against the glass. I waited, my muscles tense. Tap, tap. It was moving. The sound shifted to the next window, then another, circling the cabin. I swallowed hard. The taps weren't random. They were slow, patient, intentional. I reached out and nudged Liam with my foot. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What?" "Listen," I whispered. He lay still for a moment. The tapping had stopped. Liam sighed. "Branches, wind, animals. Go to sleep, man." I wanted to believe him. But the trees outside had no branches close to the windows, and the air outside was completely still. I forced myself to lie down again, closing my eyes, trying to breathe slowly. The tapping didn't return, but something else did. Sometime in the night, Mia sat up. I didn't notice at first, not until I heard her whispering. "They just want to talk to us." Her voice was light, childlike, not hers. My stomach clenched. I turned over and saw her sitting upright, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the lantern. Her eyes were open, but unfocused, staring at nothing. "Mia?" I whispered. She didn't respond. Liam shifted beside her, rubbing his face. "Mia, go back to sleep. They just want to talk to us," she repeated in that same strange, sing-song voice. Ben sat up now too, his expression unreadable. He reached out and touched Mia's arm. "Mia, wake up." She blinked. Her body swayed slightly before she inhaled sharply, like someone surfacing from deep underwater. "What?" Her voice was normal again, groggy and confused. "Why are you guys staring at me?" I opened my mouth to answer, but I didn't know what to say. "You were talking in your sleep," Liam said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Mia frowned. "I don't remember." No one said anything else. One by one, we lay back down. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted off. Morning came, but the fog did not leave. I woke to Ben crouching near the window, his face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting up. He didn't answer right away. He just lifted his hand and wiped at the fogged-up glass, revealing something beneath it. Small handprints, too small for any of us, and they were on the inside. I don't know what woke me first, the eerie silence, the chill in the air, or the gnawing sense that something was wrong. Then I saw Ben's sleeping bag. It was empty, For a moment, I just stared, waiting for my brain to catch up, to find the logical explanation. Maybe he had woken up early. Maybe he had stepped outside to use the bathroom. But then I saw his boots, still by the door. I nudged Liam with my foot, my voice low but urgent. "Wake up," he groaned. "What?" "Ben's gone." That woke him up fast. He sat up, rubbing his face, his eyes narrowing as he looked around. Mia was still asleep, her face pale against her sleeping bag. I got up and checked the door. It was still latched from the inside. No way he just wandered off barefoot. I stepped outside into the thick fog. It pressed against my skin like damp cotton, dense enough that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. "Ben," I called. My voice barely carried. It felt swallowed up, like the fog itself was smothering the sound. Liam and Mia joined me a minute later, still groggy, but alert. Mia hugged herself against the cold, her breath visible in the air. "He wouldn't just leave," she said, voice tight with unease. We circled the cabin, searching the ground for footprints. There were none. The dirt was undisturbed, save for the ones we'd made the night before. "He has to be here," Liam muttered, pacing. "He wouldn't just vanish." Mia pressed a hand to her forehead. I can't," she squeezed her eyes shut. "You okay?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. I keep trying to remember the last time I saw him." But she winced, sucking in a sharp breath. When she pulled her hand away, a thin trickle of blood ran from her nose. Liam swore. "Mia, sit down." "I'm fine," she insisted, though she wobbled slightly. "It's just a headache." I didn't like this. Any of it. "He was here when we went to sleep," I said. "We need to think." Mia's expression twisted in frustration. "I can't think, Ethan. Every time I try to remember, it hurts." Liam ran a hand through his hair, his breathing heavy. "This isn't normal." No, it wasn't. The fog was thicker than before. If we tried to leave now, we could get turned around, wander in circles. But staying here. I exhaled slowly. We search. 1 hour. If we don't find him, we head back to camp and call for help. Liam hesitated, torn between logic and fear. Then he nodded. 1 hour. Mia wiped her nose and swallowed hard. "Let's find him." We turned back to the cabin, its dark windows staring at us like hollow eyes. Somewhere deep in the fog, something moved. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if we wanted to find Ben at all. We searched for nearly an hour, calling Ben's name until our voices were hoarse. But the deeper we went into the fog, the more the forest seemed to work against us. No matter which direction we took, no matter how carefully we moved, we always ended up back at the cabin. It made no sense. Weed-marked trees, even tried walking in a straight line, but somehow the ground folded back on itself, forcing us to return. Mia was breathing hard, her hands clenched into fists. "This isn't real," she whispered. Liam turned in a slow circle, his jaw tightening. "We need to think logically." "Logical?" Mia let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Logical would mean Ben is somewhere, that we should be able to just walk away." She pointed toward the fog. "We can't." She wasn't wrong. The rules of nature, of reality, weren't working here. "Let's go inside," I said. "Regroup. Come up with a plan." Liam hesitated, then nodded. But when we stepped back into the cabin, something was different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The air inside was colder, the silence heavier. Then I saw it. Ben's sleeping bag was gone. Not just moved, gone. No trace of him. No backpack. No boots by the door. Nothing. Like he had never been here at all. I turned slowly toward the wooden table. The plates, the glasses, the untouched food. It was still there. But something had changed. It was only set for 3. I felt my stomach twist. My throat was dry. "The table," I said quietly. Liam's eyes followed mine. He went pale. "No." Mia shook her head violently. "No, no, no, this isn't happening." Liam suddenly snapped. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We're leaving. Now. I don't care if we have to run blind through that fog. We are not staying here." I didn't argue. I wanted out as much as he did. Mia rushed to the door and grabbed the handle, twisting hard. The wood groaned, but it didn't budge. She tried again, yanking with all her strength. Nothing. Liam pushed her aside and tried himself, throwing his weight against it. It's stuck. No, Mia whispered, backing away. It's not stuck. It's like it's part of the wall. I stepped closer, running my fingers along the edges. There were no gaps, no seams. The door wasn't jammed. It had fused into the cabin itself. We were trapped. And outside, the fog only grew thicker. The first whisper came so softly that I thought it was just the wind. Stay with us. One more, one more. A breath of sound, curling through the cabin like smoke. Then another. Stay, don't go, just one more. My body went rigid. Mia gasped, her hands clamping over her ears. Liam spun around, eyes wide, scanning the empty room. The whispers weren't coming from a single place. They were everywhere, seeping from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath us. Mia backed into the corner, her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. We were never supposed to find this place. The lantern flickered violently, its dim glow barely holding against the suffocating darkness. Something moved. In the farthest corner of the room, the shadows stretched, lengthening unnaturally, pooling into something thick, alive. My breath caught. A figure shifted there, just at the edge of sight. Not a person, not human. Then another, and another. They didn't step forward. They didn't need to, because the cabin was shrinking around us. The walls pressed closer, the wooden beams groaning, the ceiling lowering inch by inch. The table, now set for only two, creaked as its legs splintered. Mia let out a strangled sob. This place isn't letting us go. The whispers grew clearer, wrapping around us like cold fingers. Stay, just one more, one more. I felt something, someone, breathe against the back of my neck. The fireplace exploded to life. Flames roared up from the stone hearth, licking hungrily at the air. But it wasn't normal fire. Inside the blaze, figures stood, watching us. Their bodies were unmoving, barely outlined in the shifting light, their hollow eyes locked onto us. Their mouths opened in silent words, words I didn't want to hear. Liam cursed and grabbed Mia's arm, yanking her toward the window. We're getting out of here. Now. I didn't argue. I ran to the window, slamming my fists against the frame. The glass shuddered, but it wouldn't break. Then, suddenly, it slid open. The cold fog rushed in instantly, curling around us like a living thing. Liam hoisted Mia through first. She hesitated for only a second before disappearing into the mist. I climbed out next, my hands gripping the damp wooden sill. I could feel something just behind me, reaching. I leapt. The fog swallowed me whole. Liam followed an instant later, and then we ran, blindly, desperately, without direction, without thought. Behind us, the whispers rose into a screech. The ground seemed to stretch beneath our feet, as if we weren't running away, but instead sinking deeper into something. Something that wanted us to stay, to never leave. And somewhere in that choking fog, as we stumbled forward, I swore I heard Ben's voice. Come back, just one more. We didn't stop. We ran until the fog finally broke. And the cabin wasn't there. We ran until our legs gave out, until the damp air burned in our lungs and our bodies screamed for rest. The fog thinned little by little, its grip loosening, until we broke through. One moment, we were swallowed in that endless gray void. The next, we were standing on the familiar dirt path of the main hiking trail. The forest was different here, normal. The trees stood tall and motionless. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. A bird called somewhere in the distance. It was as if nothing had ever happened. I turned back, half expecting to see the dark outline of the cabin through the thinning mist. But there was nothing, just trees. Thick, unbroken forest where the cabin had been only minutes ago. Mia made a choked noise and clutched Liam's arm. Where is it? She whispered. Liam shook his head slowly, eyes darting from tree to tree. No, that's not, his voice faltered. Because it didn't make sense. We had been there. We had seen it. Felt the wood beneath our hands. Smelled the stale air inside. And yet, there was no trace of it now. No clearing. No foundation. Not even disturbed leaves where it should have stood. Ben was gone. Like he had never existed at all. I swallowed hard. We have to go to the Rangers. Liam didn't argue. None of us did. We forced ourselves forward, walking fast, nearly tripping over our own feet in our desperation to get away. The ranger station was a small, sturdy building near the park entrance, its warm lights glowing in the early dawn. The moment we stumbled inside, breathless and shaking, the rangers looked up from their desks. "What happened?" one of them asked, standing. We told them everything. Ben's disappearance, the cabin, the whispers, the way the forest wouldn't let us leave. They listened with furrowed brows, exchanging unreadable looks. When we finished, they didn't laugh. They didn't even seem skeptical. Instead, one of the rangers, a man in his 50s with deep lines around his mouth, sighed. "We'll take a look." They sent out a search team. We waited, wrapped in borrowed blankets, sipping hot coffee we barely tasted. Hours passed. Finally, the rangers returned. Their faces told us everything. "There's nothing out there," one of them said carefully. "No sign of a cabin. No sign of your friend. Not even footprints." I stared at them. "That's impossible." They only shook their heads. The official report would say Ben wandered off. Maybe got lost. Maybe had an accident somewhere off trail. But we knew better. The cabin had taken him. And it had nearly taken us, too. We left the station in a daze, stepping out into the cool afternoon air. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, golden leaves drifting to the ground. It was all so normal. But just as we reached the car, just as I reached for the door handle, tap, 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 a soft, deliberate sound against glass. We froze. Slowly, we turned back to the ranger station, to the window. Ben's face wasn't there, but there was a single, small handprint in the fogged-up glass. On the inside. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of us, a dark ribbon cutting through the empty landscape. The only sound was the steady hum of the tires against the pavement and the occasional rattle of our half-empty water bottles in the cup holders. Rachel sat beside me, staring out the window, her fingers absently drumming on her thigh. We had been driving for hours, and exhaustion was creeping in like a slow-moving fog. The night felt different out here, too still, too quiet. We hadn't passed another car in what felt like forever. The road signs had thinned out, replaced by miles of nothingness. Even the stars seemed dimmer, swallowed up by an oppressive black sky. "How much longer?" Rachel asked, her voice thick with fatigue. I glanced at the GPS, still a couple of hours to the motel. She sighed, shifting in her seat. "I need to stretch my legs, and I really need a bathroom." I was about to tell her we'd have to hold out a little longer when, as if summoned, a flickering green glow appeared in the distance. A road sign. As we got closer, I could make out the words. "Rest stop, 1 mile." Beneath it, in smaller letters, it promised restrooms, vending machines, and a picnic area. The reflective paint on the sign was peeling, and the metal frame leaned slightly to one side. "Looks old," Rachel murmured. "Yeah," I agreed, but I flipped on my turn signal anyway. We didn't have many options. As we pulled onto the narrow exit ramp, the car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating cracked pavement and overgrown weeds. The rest stop wasn't much, just a small parking lot, a couple of wooden picnic tables, and a squat concrete building with restroom signs bolted above the doors. A single street light buzzed faintly overhead, casting weak, yellowish light that barely pushed back the surrounding shadows. Something about the place felt wrong. Rachel shifted uneasily. "Let's make this quick." I nodded, but as she opened the car door, a sudden chill crawled up my spine. It wasn't the cold, I knew that much. It was something else, something I couldn't name. Then Rachel stepped into the darkness, and for the first time that night, I had the sinking feeling that we shouldn't have stopped at all. As I pulled into the lot, the tires crunched over loose gravel and bits of broken pavement. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years. A small, rectangular brick building stood near the center, with faded blue and white restroom signs bolted above 2 separate doors. A narrow walkway led to a row of vending machines against the wall, their glass fronts clouded with grime. The parking lot was completely empty. Not a single car, not a single sign of recent life. No footprints in the dirt, no litter, nothing. Just silence, thick and heavy. A single overhead light buzzed and flickered, casting jittery shadows across the cracked pavement. The effect was disorienting. 1 second, everything seemed normal. The next, the darkness shifted, like something unseen had moved just beyond the light's reach. Rachel hugged herself. It's colder than I expected. She was right. It was late summer, and the air had been warm and humid the whole drive. But here, standing outside the car, a deep chill settled against my skin. Not just a passing breeze, something deeper, as if the air itself was wrong. Rachel rubbed her arms. Let's just go quick, okay? I hesitated, looking around one more time. Every instinct in me whispered that we should just get back in the car and keep driving. But exhaustion weighed down my limbs, dulling my better judgment. The thought of getting back on that endless highway, my eyes burning from staring at the dark road, made the rest stop seem like the lesser evil. I sighed. Yeah, quick. We shut the car doors, the sound echoing too loudly in the empty lot. The silence that followed felt heavier, pressing in around us. Rachel moved toward the women's restroom, pausing briefly at the door. It's probably disgusting in there, she muttered before pushing it open and disappearing inside. I turned to the men's room entrance. The door looked heavy, its metal surface dull with age. I reached for the handle, but as my fingers made contact, a sharp prickle ran up my arm. It wasn't electricity, it was something else. A sensation I couldn't explain, like the air itself recoiled at my touch. I pulled my hand back instinctively and stood there for a moment, listening. The wind didn't blow. The trees didn't rustle. Everything was still. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, just beyond the reach of that flickering light, came the softest sound. A footstep. Slow, deliberate, and much too close. I wrapped my fingers around the handle of the men's restroom door and pulled. It didn't budge. I tried again, rattling it harder. Locked. Rachel's voice came from a few feet away. Mine's locked too. I turned to look at her. She pulled at the handle of the women's restroom door again, as if it might suddenly change its mind. But it stayed shut. That doesn't make sense, I muttered. Rest stops don't usually lock up like this unless they're abandoned. Rachel shot me a look. Does this place not look abandoned to you? She had a point. The air of neglect, the cracked pavement, the rust-streaked vending machines, the eerie silence. It all felt wrong, like a place time had forgotten. Then I heard it, a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint breath of sound drifting through the trees behind the building. But there was no wind. The night air was still, heavy with silence. Another whisper followed, low, distant, impossible to make out. Rachel tensed. Did you hear that? Yeah. I turned my head slightly, listening. The whispering grew, layering over itself, a dozen hushed voices murmuring just beyond our comprehension. It was coming from inside the building. Maybe someone's in there, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew I didn't believe them. Rachel took a cautious step closer to the wall. Hello, she called. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. And then, clear as day, from inside the building, came a voice that sent ice through my veins. Daniel. I froze. Rachel took a sharp step back, her breath catching in her throat. Another whisper, soft but deliberate. Rachel. The way it spoke our names, it wasn't a question. It wasn't a mistake. It was as if whoever, whatever, was inside had been waiting for us. Rachel's hand clamped onto my wrist. How do they know our names? I had no answer. The flickering light above us buzzed louder, its glow stuttering against the pavement. The air felt tighter, pressing against my chest. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run. But Rachel was already pulling out her phone. I'm looking inside. Rachel. Before I could stop her, she turned on her flashlight and aimed it at the small, grimy window near the top of the restroom wall. The beam of light cut through the darkness inside, revealing cracked tiles, a rust-stained sink, and a row of metal stalls standing silent and still. And then something moved. A shadow, shifting just beyond the flashlight's reach. Not a trick of the light, something real. Rachel let out a sharp breath and stumbled back. Someone's in there. I grabbed her hand. We're leaving. Now. But before we could move, the whispering started again. Louder this time. Closer. And the locked door handle rattled. I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my ears, the blood rushing so fast that for a moment, everything else faded. The cold air, the night, even Rachel's grip on my arm. But the whispering didn't fade. It grew. It came from inside the building, layered, overlapping, voices of men and women, some low and guttural, others high and rasping, speaking all at once in a language I couldn't understand. The sound shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't just coming from one spot. It was filling the space, pressing against the grimy windows, seeping through the cracks in the door like mist. Then, a new sound. A slow, deliberate scrape, metal against metal. Rachel gasped, and I didn't need to ask if she heard it too. It was coming from inside the men's restroom. The unmistakable sound of a lock being undone. Rachel's fingers tightened around mine. "Daniel." I stepped back, pulling her with me. "We're getting out of here." She didn't argue. We turned toward the car, and then we saw them. Figures, pressed against the inside of the glass. I stopped breathing. At first, my brain tried to make sense of what I was looking at. Maybe they were people, maybe someone was in there. But my body already knew the truth before my mind caught up. They weren't people. Their shapes were human, vaguely. Shadowy outlines of bodies, tall and thin, distorted by the dirt-covered glass. But there were no faces, no eyes, no mouths. Just smooth, black voids where their features should have been. They weren't reflections. They weren't tricks of the light. They were watching us. Rachel choked out a sound, half a gasp, half a whimper. Then, the figures moved. Not a shift, not a slow glide. They lunged. The entire building shuddered as fists, dozens of them, pounded against the inside of the glass. The whispers exploded into a cacophony, voices shrieking over each other, some laughing, others sobbing. Rachel screamed. I grabbed her wrist and ran. We sprinted across the cracked pavement, our footsteps slamming against the ground, the car feeling impossibly far away. I yanked the keys from my pocket, nearly dropping them as we reached the driver's side door. I threw myself inside, slamming the lock down. Rachel did the same on the passenger side, her breath ragged, eyes wide with terror. The whispers didn't stop. They were outside now, all around us. Rachel turned, staring out the back window. Her face went pale. Oh my God, I didn't look. I didn't want to see. I jammed the keys into the ignition, my hands shaking so hard I nearly missed. The engine roared to life, and then every light in the rest stop went out. The second the engine roared to life, I gripped the steering wheel like a lifeline. My hands were slick with sweat, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The rest stop had gone completely dark. The flickering light above the building, the dim glow from the vending machines, everything had been swallowed by the night. I didn't dare look back. Rachel sat rigid beside me, her fingers curled around the door handle as if she was ready to throw herself out if it meant escaping faster. I shifted the car into reverse, ready to peel out of there. Then the headlights hit the building. The windows were empty. No figures, no movement, just a lifeless, abandoned rest stop, looking exactly as it had when we first pulled in. Rachel let out a shuddering breath. They're gone. I swallowed hard, my chest rising and falling with every labored breath. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to pretend none of it had happened, that we had imagined the whole thing in our exhaustion. But my gut told me the truth. They weren't gone. Rachel shifted slightly, her posture relaxing by the smallest fraction. Maybe we just... Then she froze. Her hand shot out, fingers trembling as she pointed toward the building's outer wall. "Daniel, look." I didn't want to. Every instinct in me screamed, "Don't look." But I did. The car's headlights cast long shadows across the front of the building. Ours. The cars. The vending machines. And then, standing tall against the brick wall, their shadows. The figures were still there, but not in the windows, not in the lot, just in the shadows. They were projected onto the wall, stretching unnaturally tall, dark silhouettes that should not have been there. They weren't moving. They weren't flickering like normal shadows would. They were watching. Rachel's breath hitched. They're not moving with us. She was right. Our own shadows shifted as we did. Small movements, trembling hands. But theirs? They were perfectly still. Then, in eerie synchronization, The figures raised their hands, and they waved, not in a frantic, desperate way. Slow, controlled, mocking. Rachel let out a strangled cry. Go, go. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my foot down on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement, the car jolting forward so violently that Rachel was thrown back against her seat. The rest stop vanished behind us in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the night. But the whispers hadn't stopped. They were outside, and they were following us. The car sped down the empty highway, the engine roaring as I pushed the pedal harder than I ever had before. My hands were locked on the wheel, knuckles white, my pulse hammering in my throat. Beside me, Rachel sat stiffly, one hand gripping the armrest, the other clenching into the fabric of her jeans. She hadn't spoken since we left the rest stop, just shallow, unsteady breaths, like she was trying to keep from hyperventilating. We had escaped, or at least we should have, but something was wrong. Rachel let out a shaky breath. Daniel, I don't feel right. I flicked my eyes toward her for half a second. What do you mean? She rubbed her temple, blinking rapidly. I feel pulled back. I swallowed. Pulled back. She nodded, her fingers pressing against her forehead like she was fighting off a headache. Like something's trying to drag me. Like I'm not all the way here. A cold weight settled in my stomach. We're almost to the next town. Just stay with me, okay? Rachel didn't answer. I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The road behind us was empty. Nothing but darkness stretching into the distance. No headlights, no signs of life. But then, a shape, faint, barely there, shifting in the back seat. My breath caught. I snapped my eyes forward again, gripping the wheel so hard my fingers ached. No, it's just exhaustion. It's just my brain playing tricks. Rachel let out a small, broken sound. I turned to her just as the radio crackled to life. A burst of static filled the car, sudden and jarring, like 1,000 tiny voices whispering all at once. The station display was blank, no numbers, no station name, just white noise. Then, beneath the static, something else. A voice. No, two voices. Rachel's and mine. Low, distorted, speaking in our tones, but not in words we could understand. It was like listening to a version of ourselves from another place, another time, echoes of something that had already happened, or something that hadn't yet. Rachel's breath hitched. Daniel, turn it off. I reached for the dial, but before I could, the static cut out. Silence. Rachel turned away from the radio, her shoulders trembling. But then, suddenly, her body went rigid. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then, barely above a whisper, "That's not us." I frowned. What? She was staring into the passenger side mirror, not blinking, not breathing. Tears welled in her eyes, slipping silently down her cheeks. "Rachel, what do you see?" My voice barely sounded like my own. She didn't look at me. She just raised a shaking hand and pointed. I turned my eyes toward the rearview mirror again, and then I saw them. Two extra shadows sitting in the back seat. They weren't reflections of us. They weren't tricks of the light. They were there, watching, waiting, and this time, they weren't waving. The gas station came into view like a beacon in the night. Fluorescent lights bathed the cracked pavement in a sterile white glow, making the place feel real, safe, even. I barely slowed before pulling into the lot, tires screeching as I threw the car into park. My hands were shaking, my breath ragged. The moment the engine shut off, the silence felt unbearable. I needed air. I needed distance. I shoved the door open and stumbled out, bracing my hands against the hood. My stomach churned. My head spun. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to push away the last image I'd seen in the rearview mirror. Those things, sitting in our back seat, watching. Rachel. I turned back to her. She hadn't moved, still sitting there, hands limp in her lap. "Rachel." My voice cracked. She didn't respond. Then, slowly, she lifted her head, but not to look at me. She was looking at the car window, at her own reflection, and then she screamed. It was the kind of sound that clawed into your bones, a raw, gut-wrenching scream that sent every hair on my body standing on end. I ran to her side, my pulse slamming against my ribs. "Rachel, what?" Then I saw it. Her reflection. It wasn't right. Rachel had flinched back, her real body trembling, eyes wide with terror. But the reflection hadn't moved with her. It lagged behind, just by a second, like something else was wearing her skin, struggling to keep up. And then, her reflection grinned. But Rachel wasn't smiling. Her mouth stayed frozen in horror, while her reflection's lips curled upward in a slow, unnatural stretch, revealing 2 white teeth. And her eyes, black, a bottomless, endless black that swallowed everything. My stomach lurched. "No," Rachel gasped, pressing both hands to her ears like she was hearing something unbearable. Her reflection moved differently now, no longer mimicking her. It leaned closer, the black voids of its eyes locked onto her. Its lips moved. Silent words. Rachel choked. Her body went stiff. Then, all at once, she collapsed. "Rachel!" I caught her before she hit the pavement, her body limp in my arms. Her eyes fluttered, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, through me. I shook her. "Rachel, wake up. Stay with me." She didn't respond. But in the glass reflection of the car window, her other self was still watching, and it was still smiling. "Hey, you okay?" The voice barely registered at first. My ears were still ringing. My heart was still slamming against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Footsteps pounded against the pavement. A figure approached, a man in a worn gas station uniform, a flashlight clutched in his hand. I was kneeling on the ground, holding Rachel. She was limp in my arms, her face pale, her breathing shallow. "Hey, what happened?" the worker asked, crouching down beside me. His eyes darted between us, then toward the car. Jesus, did she pass out? I couldn't speak. I just shook her, gripping her shoulders. "Rachel, wake up. Please." Her eyelids fluttered. Then, with a sharp inhale, she gasped awake. Her whole body jerked. Her eyes darted around, wild and unfocused. "Rachel," I breathed, relief flooding through me. She blinked up at me, confused. "Daniel?" "What?" She swallowed, sitting up weakly. "What's going on? Where are we?" I stared at her. You don't remember?" Rachel frowned. "Remember what?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. The rest stopped. The figures, the whispers, the thing in the mirror. I didn't even know where to start. The worker frowned, pulling out his phone. "Look, I'll call someone, okay?" He tapped at the screen. Then his expression darkened. "Huh, that's weird." I dug into my pocket and pulled out my own phone. The screen flickered on, no signal. I exhaled sharply. "We have to call the police." Rachel rubbed her temple, still dazed. "Daniel, my head feels weird." I placed a hand on her back, still scanning my phone screen, willing a signal to appear. Nothing. I looked up, and then my breath caught in my throat. The car. The inside was dark, the windshield reflecting the gas station lights. But something was wrong. The shadows. They were still there. 2 extra, darkened forms, sitting in the back seat. They hadn't left. They hadn't needed to leave. They had come with us. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I grabbed Rachel's arm. "We're not taking the car." She blinked. "What?" "We are not taking the car." She didn't argue. The gas station worker let us use the landline to call the police. When they arrived, I told them everything. I expected them to think I was insane. Maybe they did. But when I gave them the location of the rest stop, something shifted in their faces. Because according to them, there was no rest stop, no building, no lot, just a stretch of road leading through an empty, overgrown field. They drove us past it, and I saw it with my own eyes. There was nothing there. The officer exchanged a look with his partner, but didn't say anything. Just told us to get some rest. We never went back for the car. Days passed. I barely slept. I barely ate. Rachel recovered, but she didn't talk about that night. Maybe she really didn't remember. Maybe it was better that way. But I remembered, and something wasn't right. It started small. One evening, as I walked past a glass storefront, I caught my reflection moving a split second too late. Not a trick of the light, not my imagination. A delay, like something was trying to keep up. The next night, while brushing my teeth, I leaned forward toward the mirror. I spit, wiped my mouth, and turned away. But my reflection did not. It stayed, watching me, and then it smiled. I have always been drawn to places that time forgot. As a photographer, I find beauty in decay, the peeling wallpaper, the rusted hinges, the way nature reclaims what man once built. Some people see ruins and think of loss, but I see stories waiting to be captured. It was during one of my usual searches for abandoned locations that I first heard about the house. I was sitting in a coffee shop with an old friend, Mark, a fellow urban explorer. We were trading locations when he casually mentioned a mansion hidden deep in the woods, just outside town. "Not much to see," he said, stirring his coffee. "Just an old wreck. No real history to it." But something about the way he dismissed it caught my attention. I had explored countless derelict buildings, hospitals, factories, schools, but an abandoned mansion was rare. When I asked him for more details, he hesitated. "Honestly, I don't even know if it's still standing," he admitted. "It's not on any maps. You won't find anything about it online. I only stumbled across it once when I was hiking, years ago. That only made me more curious. A house that had somehow escaped the notice of history? A place forgotten by everyone. I had to see it for myself." The next morning, I packed my camera, a flashlight, and a few basic supplies. I spent hours poring over satellite images, trying to find anything resembling a structure in the area Mark had mentioned. Nothing. But if the house was hidden well enough, that made sense. Some places just don't want to be found. I drove out of town and followed the back roads, letting Mark's vague directions guide me. After about an hour, I found an old, barely visible driveway, choked with weeds and tangled branches. The entrance was flanked by two crumbling stone pillars, nearly swallowed by the forest. This had to be the place. I pulled over, grabbed my gear, and started walking. The path was uneven, and the air was unnaturally still. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just silence. The deeper I went, the more the trees closed in, their twisted limbs reaching toward me like skeletal fingers. Then, through the gaps in the branches, I saw it. The mansion was massive, standing 3 stories high, its once grand facade now marred by time and neglect. The roof sagged in places, the windows were dark and empty, and vines crawled up the walls like veins. But what struck me most was the feeling. I've been in hundreds of abandoned places, and they all carry a certain emptiness, an absence of life, a quiet surrender to time. But this house felt different. It didn't feel empty. It felt like it was waiting. As I stepped closer, my stomach tightened. There was a presence here, something unseen but undeniable. And then, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement behind one of the upper windows. A flicker of something, someone, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I stood at the edge of the overgrown driveway, camera in hand, staring up at the silent mansion. The place had a presence, something heavy and unspoken pressing down on the air. But daylight has a way of making even the most unsettling places feel harmless. I shook off my unease and got to work. I circled the house, snapping shots from different angles. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked stone foundation, highlighting the creeping vines that had woven themselves into the building's skeletal remains. The architecture was old, early 1900s, maybe older. The kind of place that had once been grand but had long since been abandoned to time. The wraparound porch was caving in on one side, and the front door hung slightly ajar, as if inviting me inside. But it was the windows that unnerved me. They were all dark, no broken glass, no boarded-up sections. Just empty, like watching eyes. I took a few more shots, trying to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. It wasn't the usual kind of nervousness I got when exploring abandoned places. This was different. I felt like I was being watched. After a few minutes, I paused to review my shots. I scrolled through them, checking the composition, adjusting my exposure settings. Then I froze. In the second-floor window, just above the porch, a face stared back at me. I blinked. My breath caught in my throat. It was faint, almost blending into the darkness inside. But there was no mistaking it. The outline of a middle-aged woman's face, her eyes wide and unblinking, her expression blank. I immediately lowered the camera and looked up. Nothing. The window was empty. My mind scrambled for explanations. A reflection? A trick of the light? Maybe a smudge on my lens? I wiped the glass with my sleeve and took another picture. This time, the window was clear. I let out a slow breath. I had probably imagined it, my own anticipation getting the better of me. Still, my skin prickled with an unease I couldn't shake. I moved to the side of the house, adjusting my angle, trying to capture the whole structure from a different perspective. I framed the shot, clicked the shutter, and instinctively glanced up again. My breath stopped. The face had moved. It was now in a different window, on the far side of the second floor. My hands tightened around the camera. That wasn't a trick of the light. That wasn't a reflection. The woman was still there, her features indistinct but undeniably present. Her head tilted slightly now, as if acknowledging me, as if she knew I had seen her. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I swallowed hard and called out, my voice breaking the unnatural silence. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. I waited, listening, half expecting the sound of footsteps or a voice calling back. Nothing. Maybe she was a squatter, someone living in the abandoned house. Maybe she was lost. I took a step closer to the porch, considering the open doorway. A part of me wanted to go inside, to find her, to get answers. But another part of me, the part that listened to the instincts clawing at my stomach, told me to stay out. Instead, I did the only thing that made sense. I lifted my camera and snapped another picture. I spent another 10 minutes circling the house, snapping photos, forcing myself to stay professional. But every time I glanced up at the windows, they were empty again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still there, just out of sight. Finally, I decided I had enough. The sun was beginning to lower, and I had no intention of being here after dark. As I walked back to my car, I turned for one last shot. The mansion loomed against the sky, the empty windows staring back at me. I raised my camera, framed the picture, and clicked. Then I froze. There wasn't just one face now. There were two. The woman was still there, in the upper window. But now, in a different window, lower to the right, an older man stared out as well. His face was gaunt, his mouth slightly open as if caught mid-whisper. A shiver ran down my spine. The air around me suddenly felt colder, despite the warm afternoon sun. I didn't wait to check the camera again. I turned, got into my car, and drove away. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just disturbed something that had been waiting a very long time. I barely slept that night. I sat at my desk, my laptop screen glowing in the darkness. The images from the mansion spread out before me. I zoomed in, adjusted the contrast, tried to find some rational explanation. Maybe the face in the window was a trick of the light. Maybe the second figure was just a shadow. But no matter how many times I examined the photos, I couldn't explain them. The woman's face was too clear, her features too defined. And the man, his mouth slightly open, like he was whispering something, wasn't just a shadow. He was there. I found myself staring at the final image, the one I had taken just before I left. The mansion's grand staircase stood in the dim light, its banister rotting, its steps covered in dust. But in the shadows of the second floor, they were there. The woman and the old man, side by side, watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't just stumbled upon an abandoned house. I had disturbed something, and I couldn't let it go. By morning, my mind was made up. I had to go back. I told myself it was for closure, that if I went inside, I'd find evidence of squatters, old mattresses, empty cans, something tangible that would explain what I had seen. If I faced my fear, it would lose its power. I packed my gear, took a deep breath, and drove back to the mansion. This time, I wouldn't just take pictures from the outside. This time, I was going in. The air inside was heavy, thick with dust, damp with the scent of rot. I stepped cautiously into the foyer, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust covering the floor. The grand staircase loomed before me, its wooden banister chipped and splintered. To my left, an old sitting room stood frozen in time, furniture covered in yellowed sheets, a fireplace filled with crumbling ash. Something crunched under my boot. A broken picture frame. The glass was shattered, but I could still make out the faded image inside. A family portrait. A man, a woman, and a child. Their faces were blurred with age, but there was something unsettling about their expressions. Like they weren't smiling, like they weren't supposed to be remembered. Then I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. Faint, barely visible in the dust, but undeniably there. Leading toward the staircase, a soft sound echoed from above me. A tapping sound, rhythmic, faint, like fingers drumming against wood. I swallowed hard. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn back while I still could. But I ignored them. The staircase groaned under my weight as I climbed. Each step sent up a cloud of dust, as if no one had walked here in decades. But those footprints said otherwise. At the top, a long hallway stretched before me. The doors to the rooms were all closed. I hesitated. Hadn't some of them been open from the outside? I reached for the first doorknob and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a bedroom. A child's bedroom. The air felt colder here. The furniture was old-fashioned, tiny wooden chairs, a rocking horse frozen mid-motion, shelves lined with stuffed animals that had long since lost their color. But unlike the rest of the house, this room wasn't falling apart. It was untouched, preserved, as if waiting for its occupant to return. My pulse pounded in my ears. And then I saw it. A mirror, standing against the far wall. It was old, its wooden frame cracked with age. But the glass was strangely clear. No dust, no grime. I stepped closer, my reflection staring back at me. Then I saw her, standing just behind me. The woman from the window. Her face was pale, her hair hanging in damp, tangled strands. Her eyes met mine in the reflection, wide and hollow. I spun around, heart hammering. The room was empty. No one was there. But when I turned back to the mirror, the reflection had changed. The woman was smiling. I bolted. I didn't care about being careful, didn't care if I dropped my camera. I tore out of the room, down the hallway, down the staircase. But as I ran, I could feel something behind me. Not footsteps, not breath, just a presence. Cold, heavy, watching me. I reached the foyer, gasping for air, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my camera. I had to get one last shot, one last piece of proof. I lifted the camera, aimed at the grand staircase, and clicked. Then I turned and fled. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As I pulled onto the road, I forced myself to glance at the camera screen. The image loaded slowly, the dim interior of the mansion coming into focus. The staircase, the shadows, the emptiness. No, not empty. They were there. The woman and the old man, standing side by side at the top of the stairs, watching me. This time, there was no doubt. They had been waiting, and now they knew I had seen them. I hit the gas and didn't look back. I didn't go back home right away. I couldn't. Instead, I parked in town and sat in my car, staring at the last photo on my camera screen. The woman and the old man, standing at the top of the stairs, their eyes locked onto me. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt, but I still needed answers. The next morning, I visited the local historical society, a small brick building tucked between a law office and a shuttered antique shop. Inside, an elderly woman sat behind a desk, surrounded by shelves of dusty records and faded photographs. Her name was Mrs. Holloway, a local historian who had lived in the area her entire life. When I asked her about the mansion, her eyes darkened. "The old Langley house," she said, her voice quiet. "That place has been empty for as long as I can remember." I leaned forward. "What happened to them?" She hesitated, then retrieved a small, yellowed newspaper clipping from a cabinet. It was dated October 2nd, 1951. The headline read, "Wealthy couple missing, no trace of Langleys found." The Langleys, she explained, were an affluent couple, Charles and Eleanor. They were well-liked, hosted extravagant parties. And then one day, they were just gone. No records of them moving away, no signs of foul play. One morning, a delivery boy found the house locked up tight. No answer at the door. No one ever saw them again. I frowned. And no one ever investigated? Oh, they did. The police searched the house, but there was nothing unusual. No signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply vanished. And no one moved in afterward? No one wanted to, she said simply. A few developers tried to purchase the land over the years, but the deals always fell through. The house just sat there, waiting. like it didn't want to be touched. A chill ran through me. I glanced at the clipping again, at the grainy black and white photograph of Charles and Eleanor Langley. I knew those faces. They were the ones in my photos. They were the ones in the house. I should have left it alone. I should have deleted the pictures, packed my things, and put the whole thing behind me. But I couldn't. That night, against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I drove back to the mansion. This time, I went alone. The road leading to the house felt longer than before, the trees taller, the shadows deeper. By the time I reached the driveway, the sun had set, and the house loomed in the darkness, its windows black and empty. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. The temperature plummeted, the warmth of the autumn night vanishing in an instant. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my skin prickled with the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. Then I noticed the floor. The thick dust that had coated it earlier was gone. The footprints I had seen before, mine and whoever else had been here, had vanished. It was as if the house had reset itself. A soft sound broke the silence. Whispering, low, unintelligible voices, just on the edge of perception, drifting down from the second floor. My mouth went dry, but I kept moving. The staircase groaned under my weight, but the whispering continued, unaffected. I followed the sound down the hall, past the rooms I had explored before. Then I saw it. A door, one that hadn't been there before. It stood at the very end of the hallway, slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. The whispering was louder now, curling through the crack in the door like breath. I swallowed hard, pushed it open, and stepped inside. It was a dining room. The long table in the center was set for a meal, plates, silverware, crystal glasses. But everything was coated in decades of dust, untouched yet eerily intact. A single chandelier hung from the ceiling, its bulbs dead, its frame swaying ever so slightly, though there was no breeze. My eyes were drawn to a massive portrait hanging on the wall. It was Charles and Eleanor. Their faces were clearer now than they had been in the old newspaper clipping. Their eyes were dark, hollow, like they were looking at me. A footstep creaked behind me. I turned slowly. Eleanor Langley stood in the doorway. Her face was the same as it had been in my photos, blank, expressionless. Her dress hung in tattered, faded fabric, her hands at her sides. Then, a hand clamped onto my shoulder. I gasped, whirled around. Nothing. The air was colder now, thick with something unseen. My breath came fast, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. I turned back to Eleanor. She had taken a step closer. Her mouth opened. No sound came out, but I felt something. A pressure in the room. A weight. The lights flickered, then died. The room plunged into darkness. I ran. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just ran. The whispering rose into a chorus of voices, layered over each other, swelling, turning into screams. I flew down the stairs, feeling something chasing me, just behind me, just out of sight, something cold and ancient pressing against my back. The front door. I reached it, grabbed the handle. It wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into wails, filling the house, filling my head. Then, silence. Everything stopped. The air was still. The house was empty. I looked at the door. It was open. The night air drifted in, cool and quiet. I stepped outside, my legs shaking, my lungs burning. I turned one last time. The house loomed in the moonlight, the open door waiting. And then, slowly, the door swung shut. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if the Langleys were waiting for someone, or if I had simply arrived at the wrong time. But I do know one thing. Some houses aren't just abandoned. Some houses aren't just empty. And some people, even when they disappear, never really leave. I never went back to the mansion. I never spoke about it to anyone, never showed the photos, never even drove down that road again. For weeks after that night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face. Not screaming, not lunging at me, just watching, waiting. Eventually, the nightmares faded. Life moved on. I buried myself in work, traveling to new places, photographing new ruins. I convinced myself it was over. I was wrong. It started subtly. Editing photos late at night, I'd noticed something out of place. A shadow in the distance, just barely visible. A faint outline in a window that I was sure had been empty when I took the shot. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, but then the images became clearer. In an abandoned hospital in Pennsylvania, I captured a hallway filled with peeling paint and rusted gurneys. In the farthest doorway, barely visible, a woman's silhouette. In an old church in Louisiana, I photographed a stained glass window. When I reviewed the image, I saw it, her face reflected in the glass. And then, the worst one. I had been in another country, deep in the countryside, exploring an estate that had been vacant for a century. I took a self-portrait, setting up my tripod, positioning myself in the center of the decayed ballroom. When I checked the photo later, my stomach turned to ice. She was there, standing right behind me, her expression the same as always. Empty, unwavering, waiting. I don't know what she wants. I don't know if she followed me from the mansion, or if I was always meant to find her. But I do know one thing. She's still there. And no matter where I go, she's watching. It was supposed to be a simple trip. I had taken this ferry across the bay more times than I could count. It was a reliable route, even on nights like this, when the air was thick with the scent of salt and diesel, and the sky hung low with the promise of an approaching storm. The wind had picked up as I stepped onto the deck, a sharp contrast to the stillness of the water below. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air carried the weight of it, like an unspoken warning. A few crew members stood by the entrance, their expressions calm but unreadable. One of them, a burly man with a weathered face, nodded at me as I passed. "Storm's not due for a few hours," he assured a nervous-looking passenger beside me. "We'll be across before it gets bad." Inside, the ferry was exactly as I remembered, old, a little too dim, and filled with the subtle groans of metal shifting under its own weight. The overhead lights flickered every so often, casting brief shadows across the worn-out seats and scuffed floor. There weren't many passengers tonight. A handful of exhausted workers slumped in their seats, heads resting against the vibrating walls. An elderly couple sat near the middle, murmuring softly to each other in a language I didn't recognize. A young woman held a sleeping child close to her chest, her expression unreadable as she stared out at the darkening horizon. And then there was him. He sat alone, near the back of the cabin, partially hidden in the shadows where the dim lighting barely reached. His long, damp coat clung to his frame, the fabric darkened by moisture. He had positioned himself near the emergency exit, where the hum of the engine was loudest, drowning out the quiet conversations of the other passengers. His posture was stiff, his gaze never lingering on one spot for too long. Every few minutes, he glanced at his watch, his fingers tightening around the strap of a black duffel bag resting on the floor beside him. I didn't realize I was staring until he suddenly looked up. Our eyes met for just a second, long enough for a strange, uneasy feeling to settle in my stomach. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and something about them made my skin crawl. I quickly turned away, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was late, the storm was on its way, and people traveled with all kinds of baggage. Still, as the ferry pulled away from the dock and the last traces of land faded into the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was about to happen. Something bad. The first strike of thunder was so sudden that it made several passengers flinch. A split second later, rain lashed against the windows and sheets, turning the night outside into a blur of motion and sound. The ferry groaned under the force of the wind, tilting slightly as it fought to stay steady. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, just a few harmless sways, like a cradle rocking in the water. But within minutes, the movement became violent. Waves slammed into the hull, each impact sending tremors through the deck. A woman let out a short, startled gasp as her drink toppled over, spilling across the floor. The storm had arrived early. Lightning split the sky in the distance, illuminating the churning water for a heartbeat before everything was swallowed back into darkness. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then steadied, but the brief moment of darkness had already unsettled the passengers. A child whimpered, Someone cursed under their breath. The elderly couple now clung to each other, their hushed voices rising slightly as they whispered in urgent tones. I tightened my grip on the armrest, heart pounding against my ribs. The fairy wasn't supposed to be in trouble, but it sure as hell felt like we were. Then, movement from the corner of my eye. I turned my head just in time to see the man in the damp coat shift slightly. His posture was rigid, and his hands, pale and bony, gripped the black duffel bag at his feet like his life depended on it. And then, slowly, he unzipped it. It was just a few inches, barely enough for anyone else to notice, but I was watching. Inside the bag, nestled among layers of dark fabric, were wires. Metal. A small, rectangular device with a digital screen. A timer. My breath hitched. He zipped the bag shut almost instantly, as if he'd realized his mistake. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on the strap. Then, as if sensing my stare, he turned his head ever so slightly. I looked away before he could catch me, but my pulse was racing now. My hands felt cold, slick with sweat. I had to be wrong. I had to be wrong. Maybe it wasn't a bomb. Maybe it was just equipment. A radio, some kind of technical device, something harmless. But no part of me believed that. I swallowed hard, my thoughts spiraling. What do I do? Do I tell someone? What if I'm wrong? If I stood up now and shouted that there was a bomb, people would panic. The crew would restrain the man, yes, but they would also question me, scrutinize me. And what if, by some impossible chance, I was overreacting? But if I was right, if I did nothing, then none of us were making it to shore. The speakers crackled to life, making me jump. This is your captain speaking. Due to the worsening conditions, we advise all passengers to remain seated and secure all loose belongings. We are experiencing stronger than expected currents, but rest assured, the crew is taking every precaution. The ferry rocked harder, a wave slamming into its side. A woman let out a sharp cry as she nearly lost her balance. I barely noticed. My mind was fixed on the man. He hadn't moved. He was still staring at his bag, fingers twitching against the fabric. Every few moments, he checked his watch. Tick, tick, tick. I clenched my fists, my breathing shallow. I had to decide, and I had to decide now. I had to move. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in my seat, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But the image of those wires, that timer, was burned into my mind. If I was wrong, I'd make a fool of myself. If I was right, I might be the only thing standing between life and death. Slowly, cautiously, I stood. My legs felt unsteady as the ferry rocked beneath me. The storm had worsened. Rain pounded against the windows. Wind howled through unseen gaps in the ferry's structure, and waves battered the hull like something alive, something angry. Keeping my head down, I made my way toward the front of the cabin. A crew member stood near the entrance to the lower deck, arms crossed, his face set in an expression of forced calm. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a security badge clipped to his chest and a walkie-talkie strapped to his belt. His uniform was damp at the shoulders, likely from stepping out on deck to check the conditions. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping closer. "Hey," I whispered, voice barely audible over the storm. The deckhand turned, raising an eyebrow. "There's a man in the back," I continued, forcing the words out. "He's got a black bag. I saw something inside. Wires, metal, something that looked like a timer." The crew member's expression didn't change immediately. He studied me, as if assessing whether I was serious. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I wouldn't be saying this if I wasn't. The ferry lurched suddenly, and we both staggered before regaining our footing. The deckhand frowned, glancing toward the back of the cabin. "All right," he said. "I'll check it out." I stepped aside as he walked past me, making his way toward the man in the damp coat. I held my breath. The stranger hadn't moved. He was still hunched over his bag, head low, fingers twitching against the strap. The deckhand approached, stopping just a few feet away. "Sir," he said, voice firm but not aggressive. "May I see your ticket?" The man didn't look up. For a long moment, he was completely still. Then, his fingers tightened around the strap. His knuckles turned white. The deckhand's hand drifted toward his radio. "Sir, I need you to." It happened in an instant. The man shoved the deckhand hard, sending him staggering backward into the nearest row of seats. A woman screamed. Before anyone could react, the man bolted. Shouts erupted as passengers scrambled to get out of his way. The ferry lurched violently, and people tumbled against the walls, clutching at whatever they could to stay upright. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in shock. Then, without thinking, I ran after him. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to stop. What was I doing? I wasn't a hero. I had no weapon, no plan. And yet, something primal had taken over. Something that told me that if I let him escape, it would be the end for all of us. The storm roared around us as I pushed through the chaos. The man was fast, weaving through the panicked crowd, heading straight for the lower deck. He reached the door and wrenched it open. Wind and rain howled through the opening as he disappeared down the metal staircase. I hesitated only for a second before following. The lower deck was a different world. The air was thick with the scent of oil and seawater. The hum of machinery filled the narrow corridors, the rhythmic thrum of the engines vibrating beneath my feet. Flickering overhead lights cast strange, shifting shadows along the metal walls. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the rush of water. Too loud, too close. A leak, maybe worse. I moved cautiously, the floor slick beneath my shoes. The ferry's structure groaned as another massive wave slammed into its side. Then, movement. Ahead, the man's shadow flickered against the far wall as he disappeared around a corner. I clenched my fists, heart hammering. He was heading deeper into the ship, and I had no choice but to follow. The deeper I went, the worse it got. Water pooled along the grated floor, sloshing with every violent tilt of the ferry. The metal walls groaned under the strain of the storm, the ship shuddering like a wounded animal. Somewhere behind me, I could hear distant shouts, crew members, passengers, chaos. But down here, it was just me and him. I turned the corner and skidded to a stop. He was kneeling, hunched over his duffel bag, his back to me. The zipper was pulled all the way down now, exposing what lay inside. Wires, a mass of them, tangled and snaking around his central device. A block of metal, a timer. The numbers on the screen glowed red in the dim light. 1:52, 1:51, 1:50. My stomach dropped. His lips moved silently, whispering words I couldn't hear. His hands hovered over the device, hesitant, trembling. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't before. Doubt. His breathing was fast and uneven, chest rising and falling in quick, jerky movements. His fingers twitched, like he wanted to keep going, but couldn't quite force himself to. Was he regretting this? I swallowed hard and forced my voice to stay steady. You don't have to do this. He flinched. Slowly, he turned his head just enough to see me from the corner of his eye. His face was pale, slick with sweat, eyes darting, wide and unsteady. I took a cautious step forward. Whatever this is, whoever put you up to it, you don't have to go through with it. His fingers twitched over the detonator. I do, he whispered. His voice was hoarse. It's too late. No, I said quickly. It's not. The ferry isn't sinking. We're not going to die in the storm. You don't have to do this. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought I had reached him. Then his expression twisted. I can't fail, he murmured. I won't fail. And then he moved. The glint of the knife was the only warning I got. He lunged, fast and desperate, the blade flashing in the dim light. I barely had time to react, stumbling back, arms up, feeling the rush of air as the knife missed me by inches. I hit the wall hard, pain jolting up my spine. He came at me again, eyes wild, movements erratic. Adrenaline took over. My hand shot out blindly, fingers wrapping around something cold and solid, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. I yanked it free and swung. The metal connected with his shoulder with a sickening thud. He staggered, gasping in pain, the knife clattering to the floor. But even as he doubled over, his hand was still reaching. Not for the knife, for the detonator. I didn't think. I swung again, harder this time. The impact sent him sprawling, his head snapping back against the grated floor. His body twitched once, then went still. My chest heaved. My arms shook. The fire extinguisher slipped from my fingers, clanging loudly against the metal floor. I turned to the bomb. 0:14. 0:13. I dropped to my knees, my breath ragged. Think. I grabbed the bag and yanked it closer, hands scrambling over the wires. There were too many of them, looping over each other in a chaotic mess. 0:10. My pulse hammered. One wrong move and I'd kill us all. 0:08. I scanned the device, my eyes darting. Red wires, green wires, a black wire leading directly to the detonator. 0:06. I sucked in a breath and grabbed the black wire. Please. I yanked. The wire tore free. 0:05. The countdown stopped. For a long, breathless moment, I just sat there, staring at the frozen numbers. My hands trembled, my lungs burned. Then, distantly, I heard voices. Footsteps. The crew had found me. The nightmare was over. The voices reached me first. Hurried footsteps pounded against the grated floor, growing louder, closer. A flashlight beam cut through the dim space, blinding me for a moment. Then, hands, gripping my arms, shaking me. I blinked up at the faces hovering over me. Crew members, security, someone in a uniform shouting into a radio. My mouth opened, but no words came out. My whole body trembled, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving behind a hollow, gut-churning nausea. The device lay beside me, wires yanked, countdown frozen at 5 seconds. And him, he was still alive. Slumped against the floor, his breath came in ragged gasps, eyes half-lidded, unfocused. Blood trickled from his temple where I'd struck him, but he was conscious, muttering something under his breath, too low for anyone to hear. A crew member knelt beside me. Are you hurt? I shook my head, or at least I thought I did. I wasn't sure. My limbs weren't responding the way they should. My ears rang. My fingers tingled. I looked at the man again. His lips moved. His voice was barely a whisper. There are more. Later, when the storm had begun to break and I was wrapped in a blanket I barely felt, they questioned him. The police were waiting by the dock when the ferry finally limped its way to shore. They swarmed the ship, moving in tight formation, weapons raised, demanding answers. They got nothing. He refused to give his name, refused to explain. Only those same 3 words, over and over. There are more. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. I watched from a distance, exhausted, drained, as they restrained him, forced his arms behind his back. For the first time, I saw his face clearly. Not the wild-eyed desperation from before. Not the panic, the hesitation. Now, his expression was eerily calm, almost serene. And then, just as they began to drag him away, he lifted his head and looked straight at me, and smiled. People called me a hero. Crew members shook my hand. Passengers whispered in hushed voices as they passed. A news crew had already set up by the dock, cameras trained on the ship, waiting for statements. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had been a second away from dying, a second away from failing, a second away from something much, much worse. The storm had passed. The ferry had survived, but I wasn't sure I had. Because even as the authorities took him away, even as they locked him in the back of a police van, surrounded by armed officers, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As the van doors slammed shut, sealing him inside, I saw him glance at me one last time. That same eerie smile, like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for the next storm, waiting for the next ferry, waiting for the moment when I'd hear those words again, whether in a newspaper headline, a whispered rumor, or, worst of all, from my own lips as I remembered his voice in the dark. There are more. And somehow I knew. He was right. I have spent most of my life in the woods. Out here, away from the noise of civilization, I find something close to peace. The silence, the solitude, the way the trees stretch endlessly in every direction. This is where I belong. Tonight, I am deep in the forest, farther than I have ever gone before. I came for the hunt. It isn't just about the kill. It's about the ritual, the patience, the way the world slows down when you're tracking something. Out here, I am in control. Out here, I am alone. But something feels different tonight. I noticed it hours ago, as the last traces of daylight disappeared behind the treetops. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, have vanished. The air is unnervingly still, thick with something I can't name. It's not just quiet, it's silent, unnaturally so. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it's the season, maybe the animals are further away. But the longer I stand here, gripping my rifle, the more the silence presses against me, wrapping around me like a second skin. I shift my weight, my boots crunching softly against the damp leaves. The sound seems deafening in the hush. I hold my breath and listen. Nothing. No wind. No rustling in the underbrush. Not even the distant call of a night bird. I should go back. Something inside me whispers that this silence is wrong, that I have wandered too far into a place I don't understand. But I don't turn back. Not yet. I settle into a crouch, my rifle steady in my hands, eyes scanning the tree-line for movement. I should be focusing on the hunt, watching for the telltale flicker of a deer's ears in the underbrush, but my mind keeps circling back to the silence. Then I hear it. A voice. Faint, distant, yet unmistakable. A human voice drifting through the trees. At first, I think I imagined it. But then, another voice responds. Two people. One sounds urgent, almost pleading. The other is calm, resigned, as if accepting something inevitable. The first voice, sharp with desperation, cuts through the silence. You don't have to do this. The second voice, quieter, steadier. There's no other way. I freeze, my breath caught in my throat. No one should be out here. Not at this hour, not this deep in the woods. I listen, straining to hear more, but the voices don't repeat. They don't even fade. It's as if they were never there at all. I tell myself it could be campers, maybe hikers who lost their way. Poachers, possibly, arguing over a kill. I try to rationalize, but something doesn't sit right. If there were people nearby, I should hear more than just voices. Footsteps, the rustling of branches, the snap of twigs underfoot. But there's nothing, just the sound of those words, hanging in the air as if the forest itself had spoken them. My grip tightens around the rifle. I should turn back. Every instinct I have tells me to leave. This isn't my business. This isn't my fight. And yet, I step forward. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's something deeper, a primal need to know what's lurking beyond the trees. Whatever it is, I push down the unease curling in my stomach and move toward the voices. The forest feels different now. The deeper I go, the heavier the air becomes, thick and damp like a storm is coming. The silence presses in around me, swallowing the sound of my footsteps. Even my own breathing feels too loud. I take another step, then another, and then, from somewhere ahead, a whisper. Too close, right beside me. There's no other way. I move carefully now, each step measured, my rifle raised just enough to feel ready. The voices haven't stopped. If anything, they've become clearer, each word carrying weight, pressing against the silence like something tangible. Yet, no matter how far I walk, they never seem to get any closer. You don't have to do this. There's no other way. Over and over, the same desperate plea, the same calm resignation. My pulse hammers in my ears as I crouch behind the thick trunk of an old oak, my breathing shallow. My eyes scan the trees, searching for any flicker of movement, any sign of a person. But there's nothing, just darkness, just stillness. I tell myself again that it must be people, campers, poachers, hikers. But my gut says otherwise. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel natural. I shift my weight, adjusting my stance, and that's when I make the mistake. Crack. The sound of my boot snapping a dry branch explodes through the stillness, impossibly loud. I freeze, and so does everything else. The whispers stop. The entire forest, silent. Not just quiet, not just the absence of voices, but a complete, smothering silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant creak of trees swaying. Even my own breathing feels muffled, as if the air around me has thickened, pressing in on all sides. And then, I feel it. Something is watching me. I don't know how I know. I just do. A primal, gut-wrenching certainty. My skin crawls, my instincts screaming at me to run, to get out now. But I don't. I can't. I force myself to stay still, gripping my rifle so hard my fingers ache. I swallow, my throat dry as sandpaper. What the hell was that conversation? It wasn't just strange. It felt wrong, rehearsed, hollow, like an echo of something that had happened before, or something pretending to be human. I glance over my shoulder, every muscle in my body coiled tight. The trees stretch endlessly in all directions, shadows twisting between them like waiting hands. I need to leave. Now. Slowly, carefully, I start backing away. And that's when I hear it. A whisper, right behind me. I spin around, rifle raised, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The forest is still. Black tree trunks stretch upward like skeletal fingers, their branches forming a dense canopy that swallows what little moonlight there is. I sweep my flashlight across the underbrush, the pale beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, but I know I heard something. Not footsteps, not the steady crunch of someone moving through the leaves. It was a rustling, a shifting, like something was sliding through the trees just beyond my sight. Then, a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of my heartbeat. He knows. My chest tightens. Another voice, urgent, hissing. He shouldn't have heard us. The air turns heavy, pressing against me like a weight. I swallow hard, my grip on the rifle unsteady. I don't think. I act. I bolt. The silence shatters as my boots pound against the forest floor. Branches whip against my arms and face, but I don't stop. I don't look back. I just run. The flashlight bounces wildly in my grip, the beam flickering between gnarled roots and shifting shadows. I don't know where I'm going. I just know I need to get out. I know these woods. I've hunted here for years. But now, the landscape feels different. The trees loom taller, their trunks pressed closer together. The underbrush is thicker, clawing at my legs. The familiar game trail I should be following is gone, swallowed by the shifting dark. I skid to a stop, gasping for breath, my eyes darting in every direction. Where the hell is my truck? It should be close. I should be able to see the clearing by now. But there's only more forest, stretching out, endless, suffocating. The whispers return, louder, more urgent. Not just one, not just two, dozens. A chorus of murmurs rising from every direction, overlapping, frantic. He shouldn't have come. He's trying to leave. He won't make it. I clamp my hands over my ears, but it does nothing, because the voices aren't coming from around me anymore. They're inside my head. My breath catches in my throat. I squeeze my eyes shut, shaking my head violently. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. Then, right at my ear, so close I feel the warmth of breath that isn't there. A whisper, soft, absolute, final. You have no choice. I don't know how long I've been running. My legs burn. My lungs feel raw. My body screams for rest, but I don't stop. I can't stop. Then, suddenly, the trees open up. I stumble into a clearing, my boots skidding against damp earth. I nearly collapse, catching myself just in time. My breath rasps through my teeth, my vision swimming from exhaustion and terror. And then, I see it. A figure, standing at the far end of the clearing. Motionless, watching me. I don't know how long it's been there. Could be seconds. Could be forever. The flashlight shakes in my grip as I lift it, the beam cutting through the thick night air. The figure is tall, wrapped in shadows, its features hidden in the dim glow. It doesn't move, doesn't shift, doesn't breathe. It just stares. I tighten my grip on my rifle. My mind is screaming at me to run, but my body won't obey. Then, my flashlight flickers, and for the briefest second, I see its face. My own. A distorted reflection. Twisted. Hollow. Wrong. The light stutters again, and the face is gone, swallowed once more by darkness. But I know what I saw. The whispers explode around me. A deafening rush of voices, all speaking at once, flooding my skull like a crashing wave. I clutch my head, sinking to my knees, my rifle slipping from my grasp. The voices aren't just whispers anymore. They are memories. Memories that aren't mine. Visions of the same clearing, the same trees, the same moment, playing out again and again. And in each one, there I am, running, hiding, hearing the whispers, and always the same two voices. You don't have to do this. There's no other way. It wasn't a conversation between strangers. It was me. It's always been me. I've been here before. I've been trapped here before. And now, I understand. I am the whispers. I am the voice in the trees. I am what I was running from. The truth slams into me with crushing finality. I never left this place. I never will. The figure in the clearing, the thing wearing my face, slowly lifts a hand. It points at me, and as the world shatters around me, the whispers speak in unison, a final, undeniable decree. There's no other way. I gasp awake. The first thing I notice is the silence. No whispers, no movement, just the deep, suffocating stillness of the forest at night. I blink rapidly, my body still locked in terror, expecting to see the figure standing over me. But there's nothing, just trees, just darkness. I sit up, my hands trembling as I reach for my rifle. It's beside me, clean, loaded, exactly as it was when I first set out. My flashlight, still in my grip, full battery, like nothing ever happened. But I know better. I scan my surroundings, my heartbeat slowing but never fully settling. This is the same spot where I crouched down hours ago, waiting for a deer. The same place where I first heard the whispers. Had it all been a nightmare? A hallucination? Or a warning? I push myself to my feet, every nerve in my body urging me to leave, to get out of these woods and never return. But then, a sound, a whisper, faint, distant, but familiar. You don't have to do this. A shiver runs through me. This time, the voice isn't just familiar. It's mine. I freeze, my stomach twisting in a sickening knot. The second voice answers, steady, resigned. There's no other way. I barely breathe as realization crashes over me. I know how this ends. I was never the hunter. I am now the hunted. The whispers are calling. And this time, they're calling for me. And so, dear listeners, we reach the end, or perhaps just another beginning. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the shadows, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which story haunted you the most. But before you go, remember, the dark is never truly empty.